Hello, good morning. I'm David Saltzman, talking to you from Los Angeles about our book, You Are What You Love. Not to pardon me, I'm a little camera shy. I usually work behind the camera here in Los Angeles, but I'm going to give it my best shot. So, in discussing this book, first I want to address what I'm pulling as a thesis. I agree with our professor that page 19 contains the most succinct thesis, and that thesis is, if you are what you love and love is a habit, then discipleship is a rehabituation of your loves. I see him reiterating this throughout the chapters we've read, and I would contend that he restates his thesis many times. One time I find is on page 83, when he says, worship is the heart of discipleship if and only if worship is a repertoire of spirit-induced practices that grab hold of your gut, recalibrate your cardia, or your heart, and capture your imagination. That might be just a piece of that thesis statement, which is much more succinct from page 19. But I also would contend that not only does he reiterate his thesis a couple times, many times perhaps, but also thematically he's constantly re-upping or reinforcing his thesis. For instance, on page 99, I found this sort of theme to be central to his thesis, and this theme is stated thusly on page 99: worship is the sacramental center of God's transforming grace. Now, I know these last couple readings from the book focus mainly on worship, but I think that is sort of the heart of what he's getting at when he's talking about changing our habits. If we are to change our habits towards Christ, we are looking at changing the way we worship. So, when he talks about habits, he's really talking about lifestyle, about making lifestyle changes. I've been working with a psychologist for many years, and sort of a current, what I understand to be a current thread in psychology, is the idea that if you would develop a habit that's positive, your mind eventually gets rewired toward that habit. And it's as if neurons are blazing trails in your brain that become, I hesitate to use the word ruts, but they become a way for us to rewire our habits, change our habits. We need to form habits by reconsidering what we want, is what our author says. If our hearts are bent to Jesus, we'll experience more grace. So some key concepts. I see that he often what I get from his book is that he's asking us to put God first, to close the gap between what, oh, excuse me, that's my cats, I'm so sorry. Bradley. To put God first, to close the gap between what we think and what we do. So he's basically saying we're looking for God's actions in several places. He's looking for God's actions versus our actions. And in that concept, he's talking about putting presence aside and looking more towards God's activity around us. Another key concept is this idea of liturgical practices of consumerism. Talking about the way we feel when we go to the mall. And he's kind of connecting that to an idea where we can see the mall as a church, and how our culture has sort of misguided us into worshiping consumerism through places like the mall, which become these sort of liturgical or traditional spaces to go to make ourselves feel better. I find this interesting because when I went to visit Mars Hill Church in Michigan, where Rob Bell used to preach, used to pastor, they actually built their church in an old mall. I find that very fascinating. Also, he's saying a lot of times in our book, a key concept is that disciplines require practice, and the payoff is in grace. When our habits become virtuous disciplines, or part of the spiritual disciplines, part of our spiritual formation, we become conduits of grace. So another key concept is the church service as central, and us going out from there as disciples, to getting fed, to becoming what we love, to changing our habits, to putting our habits towards what we love in the setting of the church. And he gives us many different, well, he runs through four concepts of service, and he sort of applies that to his thinking. And so yeah, church service is central. Also, he talks much about the head over the heart, and also about putting God over us, over God's activity over our activity. So I think this is interesting because he talks about our approach to changing our habits should be from the bottom up, from our hearts to our heads, to feeling in our guts, to putting our hearts and what we feel over our thinking in our head. Not to be a brain on a stick, but to really feel it from our guts. This really resonates for me because I've recently God's been telling me constantly, feel more, think less. So I better this is running out of time, so I better get to the practical applications for my church. What I see as practical applications from this teaching is that we can bolster our worship at my church. We can add more gut feelings from our songs, maybe redirect our songs that use the word I and we more to focusing on God's activity, what God's doing, as opposed to what we're doing. Also, in our church, we could perhaps reinforce the narrative arc of the Bible, what we do, how we get linked into the story. Also, I thought another practical application would be to increase confession. It's been much on my heart lately in our church that we don't confess enough. We raise the triumphal victory poses and words, but we don't lament, we don't cry together enough. And I see this as coming through confession, focusing on the Psalms, and I could see that being a bolster to helping our congregants change their habits. And specifically getting into the habit of confession. So also just increasing the awareness of God's activity as opposed to our activity. Those are practical applications for Verdugo. So I think I got to wrap it up, but yeah, thank you for listening.